Web forms, globalization. In this nugget, we're going to talk about how to globalize or create a globalized ASP.NET application. We'll talk a little bit about what globalization means, but then dive into using resource files, the implicit and explicit ways of doing globalization, and we'll be using both of them at the same time, so it'll be awesome. Culture and UI culture, and how to use the localize control when you just need to localize something in place. I'll also talk about some of the globalization development guidelines, things that you kind of want to keep in mind as you're developing an application that is going to need to be localized into different languages. So globalization is the process of creating an application that can be localized. Localized is the process of turning an application from your language into somebody else's language. And ASP.NET offers a few different ways that you can kind of go about this depending on exactly what your needs are. The first way I'm going to talk about uses resource files. Now, this is typically something that you're going to do if you need to localize your entire application. In other words, every visible string in your application is going to be translated into a different language. So there's a few steps. Let me walk you through the first bit of the steps. In fact, this first technique, there's actually two versions of it, and the first one is called implicit localization. And with implicit localization, we're pretty much going to let ASP.NET handle this automatically. So I've kind of gone into the kitchen ahead of time. I've created a new web application, and I've added a button, a label, and a text box. And you can see that I've added text to these already. So the first thing I'm going to do as part of the localization process is generate a resource file. And I'm actually going to allow Visual Studio to do that for me. So it looks like it finished. Let's get that out of the way. We'll pin open our Solution Explorer here because I think we're going to need it. And let's switch over to Source View for this page. You can see here that it's gone into the source code and it's added this meta resource key. So what it's basically saying is that within the resource file, and you can see that over here in local resources, it's created a resx or resource file for our sample.aspx page. It's saying that each of these controls is going to use this resource for localization. So when I open up this file to look at it, you get the neat little editor. And it says that this button1 resource1.text is English button. Its tooltip is blah blah blah. So it's actually gone in and it's gotten the properties that it knows we will have to localize. That's the text and the tooltip, and it's pre-filled those in with their English equivalents. So button1 resource1, label1 resource1, text box resource1. .text.tooltip. If there were other properties, you could certainly add those here, and that's when you start to get into what's called the explicit localization or explicit resource, when you get in and manually create this resource file and manually apply its settings to your controls. So the next thing we're going to want to do is think about how this is going to actually get wired in. So we'll need to create additional resx files or additional resx's for different languages. Now, there's kind of a trick here. When a browser requests a web page from a server, it can, not must, it can send along information about the language and culture that that browser is using. EN-US indicates United States English. EN-GB is British English. It's not a 100% reliable way to detect the user's preferred language. Browsers don't always do that. And when the browser does it, it's inherited from the underlying operating system. So somebody might be using an English version of Windows but prefer to read German, and you're going to see them coming in as English. Now, for right now, we're going to rely on what comes from the browser, but in a little bit, we're going to talk about how to set that programmatically. So I can totally edit this resource file. I can do whatever I want to do to it. So in fact, let's just in here, we'll put edited English text, edited English label, and edited English text box. If I run this, now if I were to view my page, you'll see that it's still hard-coded with my original, let's go back to design view, it's still hard-coded with my original settings. When I run it, this will get wired together automatically, and these things would say edited English button, edited English label, and so forth. In fact, IE up here, I've got that running, and you can see that it automatically filled that in from the resource file. So the basic shtick here is you add a resource file for each language you're going to support. When the web server sees somebody coming in with that language, it automatically substitutes from that resource file rather than using what you built into the application. So it's really kind of a neat system. Here's how you would go about adding an additional culture to the system. Let's see here. Let's just copy this dude. And we're going to need to change him to, let's get rid of this copy of. We're going to change it to sample.aspx.fr. Let's do French. I'm feeling continental today. Open this one up, and then we're going to put in the French version. French button. Haha, yeah. I don't know French. So the neat thing about these, using these resource files also, is that you can send them off to a translator. Instead of sending your entire application off, you can just send this. They can look at the values in English or whatever you're working in, and then they can translate those values to whatever language you've asked them to. And you can send each different language's resource file to a different place. So that's a pretty neat little trick to be able to do. That way your application development can really work in parallel with that translation. Now, odds are you're going to want to test this, and you're going to need to sort of hack your Internet Explorer around just a little bit. I'll show you where to go do that. Tools, Internet Options, languages, and then we're going to add a language, and then I would add Frenchy, French, 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 not Canadian French or anything else. So you can add as many as you want. You saw the entire list there. And then in the languages, in the preference, we're going to move up the one we want to test in. I'm not actually going to do this because it wonks Internet Explorer out a little bit for me because I can't read French. But what it'll do is it'll make Internet Explorer pass this as the preferred language rather than English US. I'm going to move it back down again. But you can always go in here and bump these around in different order, and then when you run your web application, it'll automatically pick up whatever language it was you told it to send, and it'll munge the page and pull in the appropriate things from the appropriate resource file. Now, I said that there was an explicit way to do this too, and it's possible that you're going to have to display information that isn't just part of a control like this. You might have messages or other things you need to pass. No problem. Let's see here. We want to add a globalization folder. So let's add a folder, and we are going to call this app_global resources. And in here, we are going to add a new item. We need to pick a resource file. Haha. And let's call this localized text. So this is now going to be a resource for our fallback culture. This is our default, in other words. If somebody hasn't sent us something, then that's what we're going to use. But I'm going to add another one. Also a resource file, and here's the naming convention here: localized text.fr.resx. And the reason we're creating these is separately from app local resources is because these are going to be messages that have nothing to do with a control, not a button or a text box or a label or anything else. These are just messages that we want to have in the system. I could do as many of these as I want to. So the one I just created would work for all versions of French, and you'll notice there was 3 versions: French from France, French from Canada, and so forth. If you want to be more specific, and it's localized text dot, let's say Spanish from Mexico as opposed to Spanish from Spain. So this is a very specific language and culture. Language Spanish, culture Mexican. So once we've got these things open, we create a name for our resource. We'll call this message 1, and we'll just call this hello. Under the French version, message 1 would be hello in French. Sorry, don't know French. Over here, message 1 would be hola, or something like that. So we'll save all those files, and actually, you know what? I think I do know French. It's bonjour. I learned that by watching Beauty and the Beast with Disney. So let's go ahead and create a page over here. Let's go back to our sample page. Sample ASPX. I'm going to delete. Well, no, actually, I'll leave those there because those will still work in conjunction with this. So we're just going to add a label to it. Label. And under properties, we are going to look for the expressions. Oh, right, that's up at the top. I've got this in alpha view. Expressions. Bam. And we've got a whole thing called so this whole bindable properties area are the properties that can be bound to a particular expression. So we're just going to bind the text property over here, and we're going to bind it to a resources file. And then the class key is going to be localized text, because that's the sort of prefix that we used on all of our resources files, and then we need to come up with a resource key for it. So this is going to be message 1, because that's the name of the resource that we already created, and that's all we need to do. Notice I had to click out of that dialog box or hit enter to save that value, and then I can finally click OK. Now in source view, you'll see that it has picked up that resources binding information for the text. So rather than creating a meta resource key like that, it's actually put in the binding into the text property itself. So that's going to take care of making sure that everything gets wired up automatically. So I snuck in and changed Internet Explorer to French, and lo and behold, it has pulled the French controls names and bonjour from my message. So you can still have that sort of automatic wire up, and this is how you can do it. Whenever you assign that message 1 resource to something, it'll automatically pull it based on the current culture. So pretty cool stuff. Fairly, I mean, not completely automatic, but not super high overhead either. Now there's a programmatic way to get in and do that too. Let's see here. I'll just hook something up to the button and click event, so we've got a place to stick some code. We are going to say, you know, dim message 1 as string, message 1 equals get local resource object, and we are going to retrieve whatever it is. So the resource key is, in our example, message 1, and we're going to translate that out to a string, and that'll take care of it for us. So that's a programmatic way of getting at that information if you need it to stick it in there when it's not going to be permanently tied or associated to a particular control. And actually, this is exactly what it says. Here, go away. That's local resources. So that's going to come out of this section. If we wanted to get to our global resources, this is actually the way you're going to do that. So resources dot web resources dot message 1. That would be how you went about getting to that. So either way you need to do it, wherever you need to pull it from, that'll make it happen. Now, apart from mangling around in Internet Explorer, there's a couple of other ways that you can get to stuff, or set the UI culture. Well, actually, I guess I should back up and say that there are 2 different culture settings that you can go after. The culture applies to sort of your back end code. UI culture applies to what is displayed in the user interface. You can set both of them, and you can do it globally for your entire application here in the web config file. And let's just see, we need to get down to system.web, and you can put in a globalization UI culture. Keep in mind this is case sensitive, so consider using the IntelliSense feature there to let it do it for you so you don't mess up the casing. I do that all the time. EN and then culture is, we'll set to very specific ENUS. So that's one way you can do it. You can also set this on a per page basis in a page declaration up here. So you can set UI culture and culture the same way. You can also do it programmatically. And the reason you might want to do that is, like I said, you probably never want to rely completely on what the browser is passing. Some browsers do a better job of that than others. You probably want to provide some user interface means for a user to select the language that they prefer. The best way to do this is to override the initialize culture method for the page. That's the place that it's one of the events in the page lifecycle that happens before the entire page gets loaded and values get loaded into buttons. So you can still kind of modify them at that point. And it would look something like this: protected overrides sub. Oh man, I hate that. Protected override sub initialize culture. That's where we go. So in here, you're gonna take a look at. Go away. You're gonna take a look at whatever data you passed in to set the culture, and then you're just going to say UI culture equals, and then whatever you need it to reach. And culture, oops, you're gonna set the same way. You know, could have been from a drop-down list box, whatever else, whatever somebody wanted to put. Now, something you kind of have to keep in mind here is that this initialize culture method happens pretty early in the page lifecycle. It happens before controls are created and before properties are set for the page. If you flip back to nugget number 3 and review that, you'll see where this kind of falls into the lifecycle. So if you're reading values that are passed to the page from controls on the previous page, like if somebody was clicking a drop-down list box to choose their language, you're going to have to get those directly from the request using the form collection. So form dot whatever. And the reason is that the controls don't exist at this point. The form information that was submitted to this page does exist. You're just going to have to manually get it out of there. So I'll usually go at it with, you might say, let's say if request.form list box, if that's the list box where somebody selected their language, is not nothing, then in other words, let's make sure they actually did pick something. Request.form list box dim lang as string equal to request.form list box, and then we'll move this up here, and assuming that your list box values were valid culture codes, that would pretty much take care of it for you. A couple other things that you can do. You can say thread dot current thread, not threading, thread current thread dot current culture equals culture info dot create specific culture, and that would be from your language. And this allows you to apply that culture setting to the entire thread so that every single page doesn't necessarily, or every single bit of code in here doesn't necessarily have to do that on its own. Now another fun trick, and I told you, I'm going to take this out here. I told you that there's a couple of different ways you can do localizing, and another way that you've got is the localized control. So let's say that you don't want to localize the entire application interface. You just need to localize a piece of it. So there's this bit ASP localize, And this inherits from the literal control. I can get rid of the Solution Explorer, make a little bit more room. This inherits from the literal control, and this will allow me to basically create a placeholder for things that are going to be localized later. You can put a lot of different properties in here, but first and foremost, you probably want to put an ID so that you can refer to it. We want to run this at the server, and we can set some default text. We don't have to necessarily. There is a text property associated with it, and that's what we're going to mess around with in our code here in just a second. We would say localize 1, because that's the ID we gave it. Text equals this is localized, and that'll fill in with that. You would probably want to pull this from a resource. You're not going to hard code stuff in here. So as you kind of start doing this, whether you're using the kind of automatic wire up like I did for these controls, whether you're using something that you're going to sort of bind manually explicitly like I did here, or whether you're just sticking in a little localization placeholder. I will put some text in here so you can see it show up on the form in design mode. Regardless of how you're doing it, there are definitely some things that you're going to want to keep in mind. First of all, avoid positioning your controls absolutely. When a control needs to change its text, some languages, German is famous for this, for example, takes a lot more room to display a particular word or phrase than other languages, like English perhaps. So by not using absolute positions, you give your controls room to expand and kind of grow. You ought to think about laying things out in a table and provide a separate table cell for each control, and that allows the text to wrap within its cell and still kind of stay aligned correctly. Avoid aligning things explicitly left or right, because some languages go right to left, and the alignment would look weird in one of those languages. Try to make sure that you have a layout that allows text to wrap. Avoid using the no wrap attribute, because longer text being able to wrap in place will help preserve the overall feel of your layout. Separate things like checkboxes and radio buttons from their label text. Put them in different table cells so that the text can get bigger and still remain aligned relative to the actual checkbox or radio button. Avoid fixed widths. Try not to explicitly size buttons. Try not to set the height of things. Kind of just let that all happen automatically, because that way when the contents or the text changes, ASP.NET will be able to move it around for you. In this nugget, we talked about creating globalized ASP.NET applications. You saw how to create and use resource files, talked about implicit and explicit globalization, looked at culture and UI culture, and I showed you how to use the ASP localized control. We also reviewed some of the guidelines for developing globalized applications, including sort of having a primary goal of letting ASP.NET do as much of the layout as possible so that your controls and various other page elements can automatically expand to accommodate whatever language string you have to stick in them. I hope this has been informative for you.